Hi there, this is Edward Dindinger of Dindinger and Kohler here in Boise, Idaho. I wanted to touch on something that's been making headlines around the state recently, and that is the recent arrest that was made in the case of the murder of Angie Dodge out of Idaho Falls. This is a long-standing cold case in Idaho. An arrest was made. I think that the circumstances of this case and the arrest really shed some light on some fundamental issues with the justice system here in the state of Idaho and across the country, and as well as potential problems with speaking to the police without an attorney representing them. Angie Dodge was an 18-year-old high school student in Idaho Falls, Idaho. She was found brutally raped and murdered in her apartment. The police originally identified several suspects in the crime, one of whom was Ben Hobbs. Ben Hobbs was a native of Idaho Falls. He had been recently, within weeks of the Dodge murder, been accused of rape in Nevada. So the police thought, well, hey, here's a person who was arrested for a sex crime down in Nevada. Possibly that's connected to our sex crime here in Idaho Falls. So of course they interview Hobbs. Through Hobbs, they find out about someone named Chris Tapp, who was a friend of Hobbs from Idaho Falls. And Hobbs had made some sort of intimations that he and Tapp had been together at a time consistent with the murder of Angie Dodge. Well, after speaking to Hobbs, realizing that none of the evidence tied Hobbs to the crime scene, the police shifted their focus from Hobbs to Tapp. And they spoke to Tapp a few times voluntarily. Tapp named some other people who were possible suspects. Tapp was somewhat tied into the Idaho Falls drug culture. So he named some people, most of whom were actually fed to him by the police as possible suspects. This is a classic interrogation technique of feeding someone information, then extracting it back from them. Once they realized that none of those people could be tied to it either, and realizing that Christopher Tapp was a very malleable individual, someone easily susceptible to suggestion, the entire investigation focused on Chris Tapp. The police asked him to take a DNA test. Chris Tapp's father drove him to the DNA lab where he took the test. The DNA test did not match. Again, there was no physical evidence tying Tapp to the crime scene. However, the Idaho Falls police, again, the police can lie to you, represented to Tapp that this was the case, that there was evidence tying him to the crime scene. And in fact, they threatened him with, this is Idaho, it's a death penalty state, you'll get the gas chamber if you don't tell us what happened. You will get life imprisonment, threatened him with all these bad circumstances. The detectives who were interviewing him, incidentally, one of them, Jared Furman, later went on to become a mayor of Idaho Falls. And of course, this is a rape and murder in a small Idaho town. This is not something that happens every day. There was a lot of pressure to solve this crime. All said and done, Christopher Tapp gives a false confession. He says that he and some other person went to Angie Dodge's apartment, raped and murdered her. Chris Tapp gets convicted of the crime and is sent to the penitentiary. So, 20 years later, Chris Tapp is still in the penitentiary. The Idaho Innocence Project, which this law firm is a big fan of, takes up the case. They employ outside investigators. These investigators review all the evidence. They see that there's no physical evidence linking Tapp to the crime, and in fact, there's some salient points which indicate he could not have committed the crime. They compile this evidence, present it to the prosecutors in Bonneville County, which is where Idaho Falls is located. The Bonneville County prosecutor at the time, whose name eludes me, he obtained money from the county commission to reopen the case and hire his own outside investigator. The outside investigator looks at it and says, yeah, this is most likely the wrong man. They reach a deal. Christopher Tapp, of course, had been appealing during this time. His mother actually spent over $100,000 on his defense over the years. They reach a deal in which Christopher Tapp, his conviction for aiding and abetting rape would be vacated, but the conviction for aiding and abetting murder would stand, but he would be released. So he's released. He's still a convicted felon. Several years later, to where we are today, with the most recent news, was they arrested a man in Caldwell by the name of Brian Drips for the crime. And actually they had identified Drips as a possible suspect, and there were detectives following him around, waiting for him to drop something with his DNA on it, a plastic cup, a cigarette butt, anything in a public place that might have his DNA on it. Finally, they did find a cigarette butt that Drips had smoked. They identified the DNA, matched to the DNA from the Dodge crime scene. They arrest Brian Drips. Brian Drips tells the police that he committed the crime alone. So now here we have this problem. We have someone who's already been convicted of this rape and murder, who's a convicted felon, and we have someone else saying, I did it, with DNA evidence tying him to the crime scene, and he's saying he acted alone. Well, what does this mean for Christopher Tapp? It may surprise some people to learn that there's no necessary bar to being convicted of a crime that someone else has already been convicted for, or being convicted of a crime that someone is later convicted for. It's entirely possible for that to happen under the structure of the justice system. I do think that there's a lot of pressure on the prosecutors to do something to make it right here, and I will be expecting to see something from the Bonneville County Prosecutor's Office on that. Now, what can we learn from this? Well, we can learn that the justice system has some severe flaws and inherent flaws in it. Namely that you can be wrongfully convicted in the United States of America. It's very possible. You can do 20 years in prison, as Christopher Tapp did, before you're exonerated. And in fact, there have been people who've been put to death who are later exonerated. This happens. Now, what can we learn from Christopher Tapp? Mainly that you should never speak to the police without the representation of an attorney. If he had had an attorney representing him, this would not have happened. The police would not have been able to feed him false facts and later extract them from Christopher. They would not have been able to create inconsistencies and exploit those. They would not have been able to take advantage of this man and take 20 years of his life away. So I think that's just even more reason to never speak to the police without an attorney present, or at least without the advice of an attorney. Again, this is still a developing story here in Idaho. I'm very curious to see when Brian Drips actually pleads guilty in a court of law. Very curious to see what the Bonneville County Prosecutor's Office will do for Mr. Tapp. I'm very curious to see what kind of compensation he'll receive for the time he spent in prison for the third or better of his life that was taken away by the state. I hope one day we'll see justice done in this case. I hope you've enjoyed this short segment. If you have any questions of criminal law or any other related matter, please feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm at 208-713-8620. My email is edward@dklawboise.com. You can find me on the internet at www.dklawboise.com or on Facebook, facebook.com/dklawboise. Thanks for joining me. See you again next time.